Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we understand whether the Iran nuclear deal is actually dead in the water, what US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Chinese counterpart spoke about on the telephone, and in Venezuela, why the opposition has finally come out and withdrawn support for Juan Guaido. First up, in the period since 2018, when the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's the technical name for the deal between Iran, the US, and 5 other world powers with regard to Iran's nuclear program, it's become apparent increasingly that former President Barack Obama's biggest achievement in terms of foreign policy, entered into back in 2015, is all but dead. Several high-ranking members of the Biden administration, including an unofficial quote from Biden himself, have alluded to this fact even as diplomats, while being fully aware of the situation, stop short of accepting it in public forums. They've preferred instead to claim at regular intervals that a revived deal at negotiations that have dragged on for over a year in Vienna is still a possibility. At the latest round of talks between Iran and the European Union in Jordan, this gap between reality and diplomacy was once again apparent. Abdul joins us now in studio with the latest. Abdul, at the diplomatic level, we've heard several statements saying this deal is actually the only framework that works in this scenario and how important it is. And yet all the indications are that the deal is dead. What is the latest that you're hearing, and what do you make of the reports?
There are many reports in different media, of course, and most of them are indicating that it seems that the deal has finally run out of its life, it seems. Particularly, there was a reference to a video which was accidentally recorded I think in November, in which Biden is saying that we are not in favor of having the deal, but we will not make a formal announcement about it. So what we used to think that there is a temporary delay in finalizing the deal when before the elections in Israel or before the elections in the US, midterm elections in US, it seems that they never had an intention to kind of extend it, kind of revive the deal at all. Though these are all speculation yet. These are the informal sources which are talking about it and referring to the Biden's video. Iranian Foreign Minister Abdullahian a few days back also mentioned that though there is a window still open, after almost 2 years of exhausting negotiations in Vienna and other places and other forums, Iran is still hoping that the deal will be revived because that is the only deal which basically provides some kind of international formal recognition that the Iranian nuclear program is a peaceful nuclear program. But even he was not very sure about, and he said that this window will not be open forever. It means that the Iranian patience is also running out. And among all of this, there are various indications given by the US in particular, which it looks like that it is working in some kind of understanding with the Israelis and other of its partners that the deal by and large is no more a priority.
Right.
The statements made earlier also were indicating this, but not as clearly as it is now.
All right. And I mean, it seems quite difficult to understand the end game of putting something like this, which was Barack Obama's probably biggest accomplishment, putting it away or sort of taking it completely off the table. But increasingly over negotiations that you said, the stalemate that was arrived at was because the US wanted to focus on issues outside of uranium enrichment and bring in even, for example, the latest, the recent protests, or the wave of protests in Iran, or the supply of drones to Russia, all kinds of issues unrelated to the nuclear program. So how does that figure in the entire conversation, and obviously what will be the impact of this on the region?
Well, you rightly pointed out that for a very long time now, despite the fact that Biden had promised that whenever he will become president, he will revive the deal, There was a fascist that Trump is basically a lunatic who does not understand the significance of these kind of deals, and democratic system, whenever it will come, democratic government, whenever it will come, will be giving the depth and the significance of the deal, it will be revived. Now what we see that Biden administration, at least for last 6 months and so, has diverted attention, which is gradually becoming clear, to kind of completely destroy the deal and kind of go back to the system which was there before 2015 when the JCPOA was signed, which basically means that the reimposition of international sanctions. And for that, there is a need, it seems, to kind of portray Iranians as villains. So they are using different opportunities to kind of to build that image. The protests in Iran, which basically provided another excuse for the US and its European allies to impose new sanctions, new round of sanctions, has been used to point out that Iran is an evil regime. Apart from that, the issue of drone, the alleged drone supplies to Russians, the drone which is US is alleging that used in Ukraine, has been raised in the United Nations Security Council. There was a proper resolution moved by the US and its allies demanding an international investigation on of course, with the objective that this will lead to some kind of reimposition to some kind of relapse to the UN resolution, Security Council resolution passed in 2015, which lifted all international sanctions prior to that. Yeah. Apart from that, there is also a hint given by the IAEA about the investigation, which is ongoing investigation, despite the fact that Iranians have repeatedly said that whatever from their side has to be given and cooperated. They have done all things required, and there is no need to further continue the investigation related to the unamounted, unrecorded elements of some kind of man-made uranium found in different places, in some of the places, not different places, in some of the sites in Iran. Right. Way back in before 2015. Iran has said that this is an old issue and that does not need an investigation at this moment. And the resolution moved in IAEA Board of Governors was a political move, a resolution. Despite all that thing, the US and its allies are emphasizing on this particular issue. And it seems, if you see what Biden had said informally in November and what has been said by foreign minister and other people in the US and other European countries, in the context of these three particular incidents, it seems that there is an attempt to kind of re-vilify Iran and kind of attempt to reintroduce the international sanctions. Right. And completely negate the need of JCPOA.
All right. Thanks, Abdul. We'll ask you to stick around for a minute because next we're continuing on the general theme of US diplomacy and its misadventures, this time in the context of China. So take a minute. China has told the United States to stop using salami slicing tactics as the basis of its relationship with the People's Republic and to end the old routine of unilateral bullying. This is based on a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry after a phone conversation between its Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his US counterpart Antony Blinken this weekend. Wang said that the US was trying to suppress China's development and used a series of microaggressions to achieve this goal without having to rely on a single major incident that might provoke the use of full force. The call highlighted the tensions in relations between the world's two largest economies, even after the presidential meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali earlier. Taiwan, it can be inferred, was the biggest of a number of hot topics leading up to the remarks. China, of course, considers Taiwan its own territory and believes the US is crossing a red line. In a brief readout, the State Department, the US State Department that is, acknowledged the call and said Blinken, I quote now, discussed the need to maintain open lines of communication and responsibly manage the US-PRC relationship, end quote. The two also talked about the Russia-Ukraine war as well as the COVID-19 situation. Abdul, like I mentioned, is still with us and will be talking a bit more on the subject. So, Abdul, like I was saying, that this phone call, or at least the statements following the phone call, seem to indicate or highlight the existing tensions between the two countries. Taiwan is at the center of it, of course.
Of course. In fact, the recent defense expenditure law passed in the US Congress gives allocates $10 billion for Taiwan, basically, and also talks about how the US will, if there is a need, will provide necessary weapons to Taiwan, talks about how China is the enemy number one, in different ways, describing the need to kind of protect the what the rhetoric has been for last few years about the freedom of navigation and so on and so forth. Given the context in which this particular move has been made in the US Congress and by the Biden administration, it seems that there is a attempt to kind of deliberately provoke China to take certain measures, which basically can create justifications for other actions required, both in the region and outside it. And in that particular context, this particular development has happened. And this is nothing new. We have seen for last few months at least, there has been consistent provocations when it comes to Taiwan, Pelosi's visit, and then the visit of other high-profile people in the island, despite Chinese objecting to it, and at the same time reiterating the point that US believes in one China policy, does not believe in the independence of Taiwan, and so forth, so on and so forth. So this particular allocation, and some of the commentators have talked about it to be for the first time that there is a formal allocation has been made of $10 billion for Taiwan security, specifically for Taiwan's security. Kinds of proves the growing realization in world politics about a deliberate attempt to drag China into some kind of Cold War.
Chinese President Xi Jinping, of course, referred to this as the first sort of red line and that should not be crossed in US-China relations. Just taking it a bit sort of broader, Abdul, these series of small aggressions that the US is doing to, like you said, provoke China into some kind of action, what is the objective behind it, and how does it fit into what we were talking about earlier, for example, in the context of foreign policy with regard to West Asia or other parts of the world?
Well, exactly. If you just compare what Trump policies, which it is considered that it was during Trump's regime when this particular China policy emerged. But there is a significant difference. During the Trump's time, there was a clear-cut understanding that China is quote-unquote a rival in international politics, and it needs to be cornered. So there was Trump's moves were only to kind of sanction China, Chinese trade, Chinese company, and so on and so forth. And there was no attempt, at least formally, to kind of also recognize the need to kind of develop a peaceful relationship. So Biden's, the moment he came to power, there is a dual policy which is followed. At one time, Biden goes and meets Xi in the G20 summit, during the G20 summit, talks about needs of building confidence, talks about some kind of rapprochement, kind of going back to what Trump did, lifting certain kinds of sanctions and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, they go much more aggressive. The Taiwan case is one. We have talked about it. We have already talked about it. Apart from that, you see, there is an attempt made to drag Chinese somehow into the Ukrainian conflict also. There is an attempt to kind of aggressively talk about China's interventions in Africa during the African summit. And in all the NATO documents, which of course US leads, recognizing Chinese as the enemy number one. All these things, and also apart from that, also building sanctions in newer areas, in so-called chip war and so on and so forth. So there is it seems that during the Biden, ever since the Biden has come to power, there is a dual attempt to confuse the global, whoever is basically trying to understand what is Biden's policy vis-a-vis China. There is an attempt to confuse, but under the basic line is to kind of create undermine Chinese attempts to kind of become much more prosperous and developed and so on and so forth.
All right, thanks for your time today, Abdul. And finally, opposition parties in Venezuela have rejected Juan Guaido's attempt to increase his interim government's mandate by another year and have decided instead to attempt to take back control of Venezuelan state assets abroad, particularly companies such as Houston-based Citgo, a subsidiary of the state oil company, as well as petrochemical outfit Monomeros, which is based in Colombia. In a bizarre situation, the United States, that is, recognizes Guaido as the leader of Venezuela, even though Nicolas Maduro was elected by the people in 2018. Though the interim government has virtually no power at home, US support has enabled it to run these foreign assets and therefore redirect public revenue. The opposition parties now want a parliamentary committee to appoint new boards to run these companies and bring their revenues back to Venezuela. Prashant, what's the latest on these developments?
Right, Siddhant, it's a very ironic situation, so to speak. I mean, it's like a coup within a coup. So we do know that Juan Guaido was declared himself the president of Venezuela in 2019, caused a big, caused international outrage, so to speak, and people, all the countries of the West, the allies of the US, rushed in to recognize him, despite the fact that he had no mandate in any sense to become the president of the country. And it was popularly known as, it was basically a coup in a global sense. Of course, Maduro was in power, the vast majority of people supporting him, but nonetheless, Guaido pretended to be the president. So now what we are seeing is basically that after all these years, after close to 4 years, Guaido's own coalition has kind of ruptured. Now there are multiple aspects to this. One is the fact that there have also been discussions between the Venezuelan government and the opposition over the past many years. There have been some advances made regarding that. Also in the context of the Ukraine war, there is a demand for oil production in Venezuela as well. So that is one aspect that we need to think about in this context. The second aspect also being the fact that Guaido himself has personally lost a lot of credibility, even within the framework of the coup, which anyway did not have much legitimacy. So there's a lot of personal corruption allegations, all these kind of issues. And even for the opposition, Guaido has emerged as a very poor figurehead, so to speak. So in many ways, it's not at all surprising that they're trying to sort of dislodge Guaido from the position he is. It's all the more ironic because just recently the US passed the Bolivar, at least one house of US Congress passed the Bolivar Act. The other house is considering it, if I'm not mistaken, where they explicitly recognize Guaido's government as part of the text statement. So it's even more ironic the fact that just within a few days of this, Guaido has technically been overthrown by his own colleagues, so to speak. But yes, so I think that this is, it's not the end of the issue, of course, because fundamentally the question remains about how this opposition has even any right to control the resources they're claiming, because they legitimately belong to the Venezuelan people. They legitimately belong to the government of Venezuela, which has been elected by the people. And we do know over years, time and again, experts from across the world have certified the elections in Venezuela as among the freest and fairest in the world. And this is what the opposition has contested. So what we're seeing basically right now is that question has still not been answered. The question of how the opposition can even claim to control these resources in the first place. And their only claim to being able to control these resources is the fact that the US and its allies continue to back these elements in the opposition. So the question is whether now in the coming months we are going to see a process whereby there is once if Guaido is removed from the picture, whether there's going to be some kind of convergence around the next presidential election where the opposition might try to contest, and then maybe this, it brings this chapter in some senses to an end. That's a very important question. Really, no answers to it. It depends on what the negotiation process is, how much it moves forward, so to speak. But that's one possibility. The second is, of course, there are a lot of legal cases surrounding many of these issues. But I think it's a larger question for the international community as to how these self-proclaimed figures in the opposition can claim to control these resources, and very dangerous precedent internationally, because this is one of the most, I think, I can't think of any other country where something like this happens, where an opposition declares that it is in power, or it is a legitimate rule, and the countries sort of line up to give control of resources to this opposition. So, irrespective of whether Guaido remains or not, that question is not really answered, and I think for the Venezuelan people that would be a key question, both at a symbolic level and at a practical level, because these are actually revenue that belongs to the people, like you said. So I think that question still remains to be answered, but most likely the end of one chapter, we have to see how the US and its allies really respond to this, considering that they've really backed Guaido to the hilt so far.
Thanks very much, Prashant. And with that also, we wrap up this episode of the Daily Debrief. For more details on these stories, as always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And don't forget to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We'll see you again tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.